Well, for decades, America's pressed to credit for defeating McCarthyism and preventing its return to American life. It's a lie they tell themselves. Nobody supports McCarthyism more than the media. For weeks, they've been accusing anybody who dissents from their storyline of being a Russian agent, in effect, a traitor.
The whole Ukraine conspiracy theory line that the president can't quit, that Senator John Kennedy keeps returning to, is utter nonsense. It's vapor, it's distraction, it's deflection, it's a Kremlin talking point.
The Putin talking point that the GOP just can't quit.
They're using the talking points that come right out of Vladimir Putin's propaganda shops.
Repeating Kremlin talking points, repeating Russian talking points.
Repeating Russian talking points.
Parroting Russian talking points.
Using the Russian talking point.
Pushing Russian talking points. Frankly, it's a Kremlin talking point. Not just Russian talking points, but Putin talking points. What's going on here?
It's honestly hard to believe that's real, but it is real, and it's unfolding right before us. For example, when Ted Cruz appeared on Meet the Press, which is a show of long standing on Sundays, dwindling audience, and suggested there was evidence that Ukraine meddled during 2016, NBC's Chuck Todd, an open partisan, acted like Cruz was mentally ill.
You believe Ukraine meddled in the American election in 2016?
I do, and I think there's considerable evidence.
You do? You do?
Yes, and Chuck, let me say.
Senator, this sort of strikes me as odd.
Chuck Todd, who's wholly ignorant of everything. Oh, I can't believe you think that. You must be working for Putin. Buck Sexton is not working for Putin, we checked. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Russia is back in the news all of a sudden. We want to apologize to our friends over at CNN. We took a break. There was a moment when we weren't talking about Russia every day. But for tonight, we're going to readdress the question of Russia collusion. Now, keep in mind that the premise of the now discredited 2-year-long Russia investigation was that it was entirely plausible, indeed it was likely, that Donald Trump, a former casino owner who spent 14 seasons starring on an NBC reality show, was in fact, despite all outward appearances to the contrary, a secret Russian agent, someone who was working against American interests to serve Vladimir Putin in Moscow. That was the claim. Now, many of the non-geniuses in our media establishment clearly believed it was true. Like endlessly barking dogs, they repeated that allegation every single day for more than 2 years because that's what they do best. But the much more interesting and, in fact, important question has always been this. What did senior law enforcement officials think of the story? Did they really believe it was possible that Donald Trump was working for Russia? And if so, what evidence did they have? And if they had no evidence, why did they open the investigation and why did they continue it for years? Every American, regardless of party, has an interest in knowing the answer to those questions. And so for more than a year, the Inspector General's office at the Department of Justice has worked to find the answer. Today, the report finally became public. And yet, even before it did, some of the mouth breathers on television were happy to guess its conclusion. They proclaimed the FBI completely innocent of all wrongdoing. Because in 2019, being a progressive means taking the side of bureaucrats with guns, no matter what the evidence is. Watch.
The headline will be, whether you are a Trump supporter or a Trump skeptic, that the FBI is exonerated today from the oft-repeated smear that there was some sort of conspiracy to harm Donald Trump's campaign. It's a big deal. It's good news no matter where you stand on the political spectrum in 2019.
Now, keep in mind that when she uttered those words, the FBI is exonerated today, she hadn't even read the IG report. This is what happens when you put former spokeswomen on television and call them journalists. Their job titles might change, but they keep lying. In fact, the actual report was something of a disaster for the FBI. That was obvious to anyone who actually read it, even people who work at MSNBC.
What it says is the FBI basically repeatedly screwed up at every level, failing to pay enough attention to potential problems with Steele, failing to tell the Justice Department The Inspector General report says the FISA application was in many ways inaccurate, incomplete, or unsupported. It says, for example, that the FBI failed to look at some of the problems in Steele's past work, that was never sufficiently addressed.
The FBI failed to look at some of the problems in Steele's past work. Well, there's the understatement of the week. In fact, Steele's so-called dossier was absurd, and that was obvious from day one. No legitimate news outlet would run it. It was so clearly false that even the reckless Washington Post kept a distance. It was up to BuzzFeed to print it, a cat blog. And yet the Obama administration used the same document, the one that no one would print because it was so obviously false. They used that as a pretext to spy on the Trump campaign. The dossier claimed that Trump aide Carter Page had been promised a 19% stake in a Russian energy company, a bribe worth $10 billion. And keep in mind, when you're lying, the more specific the lie is, the more likely it is to be believed. So the lie in the dossier was he was offered 19%, not 18, not 20, 19% interest in this energy company if he could persuade Donald Trump to lift sanctions against Moscow. Now, the claim was wrong. It was made up. It was false. It was a lie. Page actually was a former naval officer, an Annapolis grad, and had done nothing wrong. And yet the FBI targeted him anyway. Prominent figures on the left accused him of betraying his country. Carter Page's life was destroyed. Worst of all, and this is what we learned today, the FBI knew exactly what was happening, and they kept doing it. The FISA warrant against Page, the one that allowed the Obama administration to spy on him, had to be renewed multiple times. And according to the IG report, the FBI repeatedly lied and excluded exculpatory information in order to keep that FISA warrant alive. Even after FBI officials obtained information showing the dossier was almost certainly unreliable, again, something was obvious to everyone who read it, they continued to treat Page as a criminal and Steele as a trusted source. Meanwhile, on television, the usual morons, half-wits, and partisans continue to accuse Carter Page of crimes he'd never committed.
There was very clear belief that Carter Page was conspiring with Russia in ways that were nefarious.
There was overwhelming evidence to have probable cause to do surveillance on Carter Page. It would have been a dereliction of duty for our FBI not to have sought a surveillance warrant.
As you say, it makes a compelling case that there is probable cause to believe that Carter Page was acting as an agent of a foreign power.
These people are sick.
Imagine if that was you. Imagine if some idiot former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade was on television day after day, in effect, accusing you of treason. And then congressmen and TV reporters all nodded and agreed, oh yeah, that sounds right. The FBI knew you didn't do it, but instead of lift the burden of suspicion from your shoulders, instead lied in order to hide your innocence. That was Carter Page's life for years. It's hard to believe it could happen in this country, but it did happen. Let's hope Carter Page spends the rest of his life suing every one of these people into bankruptcy. And that list should include malicious liars like former CIA head and CNN contributor John Brennan. Watch Brennan with a straight face say something that we now know was absolutely false.
Do you know who commissioned the Steele dossier?
I don't.
Did the CIA rely on it?
No.
Why not?
Because we didn't. It wasn't part of the corpus of intelligence information that we had. It was not in any way used as a basis for the intelligence community assessment that was done.
Yeah, it wasn't in any way. Well, of course, it was the basis of that assessment. And Carter Page wasn't the only innocent American caught up in this witch hunt, and witch hunt is not an overstatement. According to the report today, the FBI repeatedly employed confidential informants and undercover agents to collect intelligence on members of the Trump campaign. Meanwhile, the Bureau itself used a so-called defensive briefing to monitor what the campaign was doing. Now, defensive briefings are designed for the good of the country. The Bureau shares intelligence with leading presidential candidates or presidents-elect, so that at some point they will have a grounding in what's going on in the world when they take control. In this case, however, the FBI used that briefing to spy on Trump's staff and to build criminal cases against them. Can you imagine? The IG report claims that none of these abuses were politically motivated. Now, that's a subjective judgment. It's hard to know, but it's also hard to swallow that claim. Only a partisan could believe something as absurd as the Steele dossier. But let's say the IG report is right, and none of these abuses were politically motivated. Okay, fine. We'll grant you that. Does that reassure you? The facts remain. the FBI used flimsy excuses to spy on an American citizen and monitor a rival presidential campaign. It repeatedly engaged in abusive behavior to ensure that that spying continued illegitimately. So it almost doesn't matter what the motive for all of that was. The facts alone ought to scare you. This afternoon, former FBI Director Jim Comey released an op-ed responding to the report, which you've likely seen before the rest of us, of course. Think about that for a minute. At this point, given what we know, Comey ought to be groveling for forgiveness from the rest of us. He ought to be relocating to Paraguay in shame, actually. But of course he's not. Comey isn't embarrassed at all. In fact, he's more self-righteous than ever. Jim Comey's a good person, unfortunately or not. When he gets to heaven, he'll intercede on your behalf. But, there's only so much he can do. The FISA surveillance was approved by a federal judge, Comey tells us. He omits the fact that the FBI lied to the judge. The FBI didn't insert spies into Trump's campaign, Comey claims. No, they just used spies to monitor the campaign staff. Right, okay, and so on. Like you'll never know the difference. Jim Comey doesn't think you have Google, apparently. Or more likely, he doesn't care if you have Google. He doesn't care what you know. Because they could issue 100 IG reports, every one of them exposing Jim Comey as the sinister fraud he so clearly is. And he knows that none of it matters. Because he knows he will never be punished. That's part of what we learned today. What else did we learn? Well, for that, we are joined, we're always happy to be joined, by Federalist Senior Editor Molly Hemingway. Molly, thanks a lot for coming on.
Great to be here with you.
What's your takeaway from that? As someone who's followed this from day one, what's your takeaway from this report?
This was a report looking into whether there was abuse of the FISA process. And there is no question that the IG found rampant abuse of the FISA process. Literally dozens of instances of the FBI engaging in bad behavior as it sought to spy on a member of the Trump campaign. So the spin that you were showing from other people shows that people weren't actually reading the report. It's even worse than one of the things that you were talking about, which is in one case you had an FBI lawyer doctor evidence to make it seem like a different federal agency had said something opposite of what it had said. That other federal agency had said that Carter Page was a helpful asset to them. And he doctored that evidence to make it seem like the opposite was the case.
Let me ask you to pause there and ask the obvious, which is, why isn't that FBI lawyer in prison?
Well, that FBI lawyer was one of the only people who was referred for any type of accountability. That is one of the things that's frustrating. This IG outlines hundreds of examples of bad behavior from the people that were engaged in this campaign to target the Trump campaign, and yet not very many people will ultimately be held accountable by the Inspector General. It is interesting to note.
Meanwhile, Roger Stone is facing life in prison for not remembering who he spoke to one day.
Right. The kindest possible explanation is given for every one of these behaviors done by these FBI agents and others at the Department of Justice. Even though they all did show political bias, or many of them showed political bias, that's explained away. It is interesting to note that the Attorney General and the federal prosecutor looking into this disagreed with some parts of the IG report in a way that shows that it's even worse. They say they disagree that the flimsy predicate used to start the investigation was sufficient, among other things.
Amazing. Amazing. But it's not a big deal, Molly. Don't you worry.
It's really important that people do note that Carter Page was, in fact, exonerated here, that his claims that he was not a Russian asset are shown to be true by this Inspector General report, that the claims that he was a Russian asset were shown to be false, and that the willful manipulation of that information to make that
I hope he sues the other cable channels, and I mean that. He has a suit. They destroyed his life. They owe him. Molly, thank you so much.
Thank you.
U.S. Attorney John Durham is conducting his own investigation into the origins of the Russia probe. After today's IG report came out, Durham took a rare step of issuing a statement saying, as Molly just suggested, that he disagrees with several of the report's findings, in particular about why the Russia investigation began. Stephanie Grisham is, of course, the press secretary at the White House, and she joins us tonight. Stephanie, thanks so much for coming on. So as you assessed this report, what jumped out at you?
Well, people need to be held accountable. This was a government trying to overthrow a president by falsifying documents and by lying and by ruining the lives of many, many people.
So I think for a lot of people watching, and you hate to have people become more cynical the more news they ingest, but it's hard not to have that happen. People are wondering, no one's going to be indicted? when law enforcement agencies destroy American citizens on the basis of no evidence for political reasons and they get away with it? How does that happen?
I don't know. I mean, it's been a chilling effect to read the report and to see everything today has been chilling. And with Durham, he's going to look into it more and we'll see what happens there. People who are supposed to be enforcing the law took the law into their own hands, and that's really scary. And there needs to be people held accountable, not just the one FBI attorney who falsified documents against Carter Page, who was working with another agency. Yes. Absolutely, people need to be held accountable.
What's so troubling about all of this is that even if, as the report claims, politics were not behind these screw-ups, and it was just a purely apolitical series of dishonest steps, you know, the FBI remains the FBI with awesome power. People are still getting investigated by the FBI. Can we trust that the FBI is on the level? I guess that's the most important question.
Well, as the president has always said, there are great people working in the FBI, hardworking people, but people at top levels need to be looked at, and they need to be looked at all the time. They have great power, as you just said, and so it's very, very important that we really look into this. We find who is responsible, and there are absolute, there's something that happens.
Right, consequences. Do you believe it's likely that the Attorney General, Mr. Barr, will be firing some people?
I hope so. I can't get ahead of him. I'm not gonna speculate on what, but I certainly hope so. This is a chilling effect, and the American people need to believe that the FBI, the CIA, all of the intelligence organizations in this country are to be trusted. And the fact that for years now there has been an effort to overthrow this president, it's scary, and it shouldn't happen to any president. I don't care what party you're in.
Yeah, and that a lot of the media is cheering them on.
Cheering them on constantly.
Stephanie, great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Abuse report is officially out, and tonight the deep state, they need to understand they are all in deep legal jeopardy. Premeditated fraud perpetrated repeatedly on the FISA court with all the unverifiable lies from Hillary Clinton's bought and paid for dirty Russian dossier put together by Christopher Steele, who had only one source. Yeah, a guy that was an egomaniac known to lie. Nothing but outright lies, corruption, abuse of power, a massive political bias, omission on multiple occasions of exculpatory evidence. It is now, right here, in black and white, for all to see. 434 pages, 17 identified significant failures, inaccuracies, and omissions. One single source Steele had, and that even Steele said was an unreliable liar and egomaniac. And this source said none of his information was meant to be used by anybody, and that everything we on this program with our, I can't mention everybody, our ensemble cast, everything we told you about Hillary Clinton's unverifiable, bought and paid for, dirty Russian dossier is true, and it was, as we told you, without the dossier, without the dirty dossier, no FISA warrant. It's all in the report. It was central, it was essential. Basically, it was almost all of the application, but for three minor other details to get this warrant against Carter Page, the backdoor into all things Trump campaign transition, and then the Trump presidency, deep into the Trump presidency. And as we told you, it was one massive coordinated effort by Comey's corrupt FBI. Comey's corrupt. And by the way, Jim, come on the show. Oh, you want to go on Fox? Come on the #1 show on cable, full hour tomorrow night. Wide open for you. 3 hours on my radio show. 625 stations. Come on, Super Patriot. I got a lot of questions for you because you're backed in the corner on a lot of different lies that you may be so arrogant you don't even know you told them. By the way, all to gain this backdoor into all things Trump, transition, candidacy, and then presidency. These people are sick. Everything we have been reporting for years was dead on accurate. We were right every step of the way. Look at this. According to the Attorney General William Barr today, the Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken in the rush to obtain and maintain is a key word in this, the FISA surveillance of Trump campaign associates. FBI officials knowingly misled the FISA court. They knowingly and purposely omitted
critical exculpatory facts from their filings, and they knowingly suppressed or ignored information negating the reliability of their principal source. There was only one source. It was a bad source. Quote, the malfeasance and misfeasance detailed in the Inspector General's report reflects a clear abuse of the FISA process. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Inspector General Horowitz does not have the power, as we told you, to empower a grand jury or panel, or conduct warrants, or press charges. Nor did Horowitz have the ability to reach beyond the confines of the DOJ and the FBI for answers. Remember in his previous reports, we have told this to you before, oh yeah, he referred Comey, McCabe, lying, government information, all of this. They were all referred. Nothing has happened. But as for the Attorney General Barr and the U.S. Attorney John Durham, both of them took a very, very powerful stance today. They both have the power to do all of that. And in this case, it is now in their hands. And as we speak, the Durham probe into the origins of the Russian witch hunt and much more is now ongoing. And in a very rare public statement, frankly unprecedented even, John Durham earlier today disagreed with the FISA report's one conclusion on criminal intent. This is a preview of coming attractions. Quote, I have the utmost respect for the mission of the Office of Inspector General and the comprehensive work that went into the report prepared by Mr. Horowitz and his staff. Key line here. However, our investigation is not limited to developing information from within component parts of the Justice Department. In other words, he's basically saying that Horowitz had a very narrow purview with which he could work. Our investigation has included developing information from other persons' entities, both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. Italy, Great Britain, Australia, just comes to mind. Based on the evidence collected to date, and while our investigation is ongoing, last month we advised the Inspector General that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to prediction on how the FBI case was opened. Well, what is Mr. Durham saying here? Clearly, he is signaling they have found evidence of criminal conspiracy with the intent needed legally to warrant a prosecution. That statement there, coupled with Attorney General Barr's statements, coupled with that speech we told you about the Attorney General gave, should send a shiver up the spine of each and every high-ranking official responsible for this disgusting, despicable abuse of power and corruption. John Durham is now very strongly hinting the origins of the Russia probe weren't just wrought with inaccuracies and errors, but instead downright unlawful. In other words, let me sum it up even more clearly. If I were Jim Comey, Andrew McCabe, Clapper, Brennan, Strzok, Page, I'd be a little petrified by the comments of both Barr and Durham. And while we await the results of Durham's criminal investigation, it is very important not to overlook the damning findings inside of this Inspector General FISA report abuse. Let us start with a review of the very basis of the FISA abuse. As we told you now for some time, it was true. Nunes got it right. Grassley Graham got it right. Christopher Steele's dirty Russian dossier, bought and paid for by Hillary Clinton and the DNC. According to the report, that dossier, quote, played a central and essential role in the FISA request against Trump campaign associate Carter Page. Read pages 120 to 130 and you will see if you don't have the dirty dossier, you didn't get the FISA application and the FISA warrant. In fact, the report is clear about that. And basically say, no dirty dossier, no warrant. All have reported Steele's so-called intelligence was unverifiable garbage. That is confirmed today. And Steele told the Inspector General that this dossier was not a finished product. Remember the interrogatory in Great Britain? He said, I have no idea if any of it's true. It was mostly based on one single source, a compromised source, a non-reliable source with a massive ego who apparently liked to make things up. It was uncorroborated intelligence. All of it we now know was unverifiable. But every time, all four of those warrants, three of which Jim Comey signed, said at the top of the FISA application, verified. Quote, it gets worse. Steele himself was not the originating source for any of the so-called factual information in his reporting. Steele instead relied on a primary subsource for information, who used his or her network of subsources to gather information. There's only one source. Pay close attention. This is huge. The FBI conducted interviews of that primary subsource, the one source that, in fact, was used for the dossier by Christopher Steele. That was in January, March, and May of 2017. That raised significant questions about the reliability of the Steele election reporting. The primary and only subsource told the FBI that she had not seen Steele's reports until they became public that month, and that she made statements indicating that Steele misstated or exaggerated the one primary source statements in multiple selections of the reporting. Now, this primary subsource felt that the tenor of Steele's report was far more conclusive than was justified, and the subsource, primary, only subsource for the most part, stated he or she never expected Steele to put the primary subsource's statements in reports or present them as facts. The primary subsource explained that his or her information came from, quote, word of mouth and hearsay. Here we go again. Conversation that he or she had with friends over beers in a bar, and that some of the information, such as allegations about, Trump's sexual activities, 2 hookers, Ritz-Carlton, Moscow, they were statements he or she heard in a bar, made in jest. I'm not making that up. The primary subsource said the corroboration for her information was zero. Yet on the second and third renewals, Comey's FBI merely wrote that they found Russia-based subsource to be truthful and cooperative. That is a lie. The second and third renewals were outright lies. By the way, I would argue so is the first. With this, by the way, you can go find that on pages, 186 to 190. With this information alone, we have now criminal conspiracy to commit fraud on a FISA court to deny one American, Carter Page, who turns out actually served his country and worked, likely for the CIA, and cooperated to help the country he loved, as he had told me in multiple interviews. Remember, at the top of every FISA application is the word, Jim, pay attention, Comey, pay close attention. You signed 3 times. At the top it says verified. We now know that all the information, the vast majority of information, the bulk of information was unverifiable. And according to a former deputy AG, Rod Rosenstein, senior law enforcement official, remember he said this? He must swear that the FISA application is true and correct based on admissible evidence and credible witnesses. None of what Rosenstein says right here happened. None of it. And he signed the 4th warrant, the 3rd renewal warrant. He has a lot of explaining to do himself. Take a look.
There's a lot of talk about FISA applications, and many people that I see talking about it seem not to recognize what a FISA application. A FISA application is actually a warrant, just like a search warrant. In order to get a FISA search warrant, you need an affidavit signed by a career federal law enforcement officer who swears that the information in the affidavit is true and correct to the best of his knowledge and belief. And that's the way we operate. And if it's wrong, sometimes it is, if you find out there's anything incorrect in there, that person is going to face consequences.
We sit back, we listen, and I say, these people are something wrong with them. Only in Kentucky can somebody be so precise. You are right about that. These people are sick.
Consequences. Rod, you signed the fourth warrant, the third renewal. Okay, and Jim, you signed 3 of them. Super Patriot. In October 2016, yep, Jim Comey signed off on the initial FISA warrant against Carter Page, which denied him his constitutional rights and his civil liberties. And, by the way, signed off on something that was unverifiable. He knew it wasn't corroborated. They all knew. He knew the primary subsource refuted Steele's so-called intelligence. He knew Christopher Steele had serious credibility issues, and they lied about that. He knew Steele had sketchy ties with Russian oligarchs. He knew Steele was being funded by the Clinton campaign, and they hid that fact. Why wasn't the fact Hillary Clinton bought and paid for the dossier front and center right before the FISA judges? They also knew that, and they hid it, just as we have been reporting. And Comey would have to be a complete and total moron, and I don't rule that out, by the way, not to know that Steele was leaking his information to the press. In fact, the FBI included circular reporting. Remember we told you this? You know, you got hacks like, conspiracy theorist Michael Isikoff, David Corn. They're fed information. They don't corroborate it. They just run with it as if it's gospel. Wow, great reporting, Mike Isikoff. Christopher Steele was the lone source for that Yahoo News report by Michael Isikoff. Political hack that he is. And Steele was ultimately fired as a source by the FBI for leaking. But he had such credibility. But guess what? Even as late as April 2018, there's Super Patriot Jim Comey calling Steele a reliable source. Take a look.
Christopher Steele, is he considered reliable according to your sources as an intelligence agent?
Yes.
What's your assessment of that dossier?
As it was described to me when it came in, it was raw intelligence, so a series of reports from a credible person with a reliable track record and a known, experienced, and source network in Russia. And so it was something to be taken seriously. It didn't mean that it was all true, but it was to be taken seriously. And its core assertion was corroborated by other intelligence. Its core assertion being the Russians have a campaign going on to interfere in the American election.
That was then and remains today a total lie. One of many from Mr. Super Patriot Jim Comey. And this is important. We haven't even discussed the glaring omissions in the FISA applications. Oh yeah, that's a big deal too. On multiple occasions, Comey's FBI withheld exculpatory information from the FISA court. They omitted Carter Page had previously assisted a U.S. government agency, our CIA. In fact, an FBI attorney actually altered an email so that it stated the opposite about Carter Page. That Page was not a source for the government agency when in fact he was. They omitted damning information that determined Steele's subsource, again, a boaster and egoist. And they omitted 2 exculpatory statements for George Papadopoulos. He spent 2 weeks in jail when he was being surveilled, saying outright no interference at all. They just kept that out with the Trump campaign and Russia. One omission after another, one lie after another. Why lie about the subsource to get Trump? Why lie about the true status of Carter Page? Apparently helped, worked undercover, risking his life to help the CIA and was fully cooperative at all points to get Trump. Why lie about unverified single source Clinton bought and paid for that dirty dossier from Russia? Of course, to get Trump. Why not tell the court, the FISA court, that the Clinton campaign paid for it right up front, right in their grill, because you know they would have denied the application. You got the dirty dossier, you got omissions, exculpatory information withheld, circular reporting, the surveillance of campaign officials. It was just their means to an end. Here now, ranking member of the Intel Committee, Congressman Devin Nunes, along with Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan. Devin, your Nunes memo, dead on accurate, along with the Grassley-Graham memo. Jim Jordan, you had a great point today. They weren't just spying on 2 Americans, they were actually spying on 4 Americans. Devin, we'll start with you.
Well, Sean, remember what I said when we first came here is that the Steele dossier, the Clinton paid for dirt, and using that to create fake news, that wasn't the worst of it. Remember I said there was something equally as bad. Well, finally today, people get to know the truth. It's being glossed over. But here's what it was. The FBI ran spies, you can say spies, because it's people that were recording the conversations of both Papadopoulos and Carter Page. So this was before the FISA, so they were already spying before the FISA. Then there was exculpatory evidence in that for both Papadopoulos and Page, and that was never given to the court on the very first FISA. To me, that's even worse than using the Clinton paid for dirt. Now what Horowitz found, he found even extra. It's like the cherry on top of the ice cream. Now we actually have one of the top lawyers doctoring the evidence. It doesn't get any worse for this for the FBI, and a lot of heads have to roll, and I hope Durham can get to the bottom of it.
Jim, your point about 4 Americans spied on, not just 2 as we originally thought, that's key. The dirty dossier. They actually say in the report there were only 3 minor other details. It was all the unverifiable dossier. That was it. It wasn't the bulk. It was it. Then we got the comments of Barr and Durham. And this is interesting to me, because the way I interpret it is they're saying, yeah, Horowitz was limited in what he could do because it was confined to the DOJ and FBI. Oh, no. Our investigation has taken us overseas and sources in areas where Horowitz couldn't go to get the truth we have now found.
Yeah, and even if you accept Horowitz that there was a proper predication for starting this, by January they should have stopped. And this is the part that bothers me the most, because they didn't stop all the exculpatory information, all the information they got, all the things they learned about the dossier, all the information that Steele relied on that wasn't accurate, that was given to the court, all the lies to the court. Because they didn't stop, we wind up getting the Bob Mueller investigation, and what that put our country through for over 2 years. That is the worst. That's the real takeaway here. And remember, on May 9th, Jim Comey is fired. When we deposed him after he was fired, he told us all the way up until May 9th, they still didn't have anything. And that's exactly what Michael Horowitz told us in this report. But they didn't care. Because they kept it going, we got the Mueller investigation, what our country had to live through.
These people are living through the Ukrainian impeachment coup attempt. We got one right after another. Why ever govern for the people of this country or lift a finger to help people? Safety, security, peace, and prosperity. Not even an option. Devin Nunes. Now, let's ask you, when you go to the comments, particularly Barr and Durham, very revealing, very hard-hitting, unprecedented, and when you couple it with the previous statements of the Attorney General, I don't believe any Attorney General of the United States would be saying that unless he knew dead-on accurate, perfect, that they've got it. They've got it all.
Yeah, I think what the difference here is between the Horowitz report, which I know the mainstream media is just loving that Horowitz said, well, from the information that we've seen, they met the standard to start an investigation. Remember, that is such a low standard, and it probably needs to be changed. But here's what Horowitz couldn't get to the bottom of it. Why were they spying before July 31st, and who ordered the spying? That's the problem here. Horowitz couldn't find it. Perhaps Durham has been able to find it.
When apparently a lot of times have been spent in Italy, Great Britain, a lot of conversations with the Australians. Is there a very good likelihood, very prominent people in our intelligence community likely outsourced the spying on Americans to circumvent American law? Do you believe that happened, both of you, Jim Jordan and Devin Nunes?
I assume they're hanging out in those places because that's where Joseph Mifsud was. So remember, he's the one guy who lied to the FBI and was never charged with the crime. Anyone else who gave any type of false information to the FBI was charged with the crime, including a 3-star general, Michael Flynn, who they were spying on and investigating clear back when this thing started. So I assume that's why they're there. The good
they were looking for dirt on him. Can you imagine? This is how we treat 33-year veterans. All right, Devin, last word.
Well, I would just add to it, the spies that originally got the dirt on General Flynn way back in 2014 are the same spies that were spying pre the 31st of July, same spies that were spying in August of 2016. None of that evidence ever made it to the FISA court. So I think that's what they have to get to the bottom of, is who was running this spy ring. That's really the bottom line.
You both have been over the target. You have served your country well. Vindication for both of you. Thank you for your hard work in spite of a ton, an avalanche of criticism by liars in the mob and the media and Democrats that don't care about truth anymore or civil liberties, apparently.
We choose truth over facts.
Now, if you walk by a TV today You may have thought that someone had messed with your DVR, that you were watching impeachment hearings from last week. Judiciary Committee Chair Jerry Nadler presided over what can only be described as a televised competitor to Ambien. Okay? Politicians questioning lawyers about stuff they were thinking and doing as they were doing the investigation of the Ukraine impeachment investigation. But I have a question. Where was the original inquisitor, the ultimate witness? Well, he was nowhere to be found.
Where is he? I don't know where he is. He found us.
He must have friends.
Friends? What's this guy?
Oh, Adam Schiff. He's like the kid who kind of pulls the fire alarm and skips out on the rest of the day at school. Yet even without him today, there were a few very amusing flashpoints at this sideshow hearing.
How many subpoenas were issued to AT&T?
I don't know.
Maybe your chairman could be here to actually answer this. Who ordered to find out if Nunez's number was on those calls? Be careful, you're under oath.
I know I'm under oath, sir.
Then answer the question.
And I will answer the question, if you give me a second here.
How did you include it in the report? After not saying anything else about this?
Well, I'm not going to get into the deliberations of our investigation.
And that's the problem. I'm done with you for right now. We're done.
Goldman turned a whiter shade of white there, and he says it pales a ghost. Well, that was about as close as you get to exciting what was otherwise a Judiciary Committee run by the politically and ethically impaired. If the ratings were lame for Fiona Hill and Ambassador Sondland, they weren't any better for a bunch of no-name attorneys that actually work for the committee. Now, another issue. Now, it's time to separate fact from fiction on the Inspector General report. As predicted, Democrats are hailing the release as a big relief and a vindication. Don't believe that for a nanosecond. In fact, the report, as I mentioned to Hannity, is a devastating indictment of our FBI and our intel gathering apparatus. It exposes the use and abuse of confidential human sources, and in excruciating detail. I'm not kidding about footnote 473. In footnote after footnote, we see that our surveillance state was being used to troll a political presidential campaign. And it was a campaign, of course, that scared every member of the D.C. establishment for what it stood for. Now, the report paints such a damning picture of the FBI's conduct in opening this investigation of the Trump campaign that even NBC's chief legal reporter couldn't spin it otherwise.
The FBI basically repeatedly screwed up at every level, failing to pay enough attention to potential problems with Steele, failing to tell the Justice Department. And it says at one point that the FBI decided to seek this FISA warrant, even at the risk of being criticized for doing it later. The Inspector General report says the FISA application was in many ways inaccurate, incomplete, or unsupported.
Other than that, it's perfectly fine to destroy people's lives and trigger an ongoing investigation that dragged the country through this nonsense for 2 years. Now, although Horowitz inexplicably found no evidence of political bias in the FBI's decision to surveil the Trump campaign, I'm going to get to that later, he laid out at least, and I'm saying at least 17 major problems with the FBI's use of FISA warrants. That's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants. Now, remember, the reason that many of us said that the entire Mueller investigation itself was tantamount to being the fruit of the poisonous tree was because, as Horowitz is now concluding, the first warrant filed with the secret FISA court was almost entirely reliant on the discredited Steele dossier. Now, although that's not what the anti-Trump coalition has been saying, of course, for the last 2 years.
The Steele dossier only made a very small part of what the FBI used to get permission to surveil Carter Page.
The FBI only used a very small part of the Steele dossier.
It accurately reflected what we knew about Mr. Steele.
There was a significant amount of additional material about Page, and the dossier was part of that, but was not all of it or a critical part of it.
We choose truth over facts.
That's complete lies. Horowitz notes, the receipt of Steele's election reporting on September 19, 2016, played a central and essential role. Read it again. Central and essential roles for Jim Comey, if he's a little slow tonight, in the FBI's and department's decision to seek the FISA order, despite the fact that the FBI obtained additional information raising significant questions about the reliability of the Steele election reporting. You see what I'm saying? They knew that the Steele stuff was bogus, or at least very weak, yet they still went for it. The IG also found that the FBI failed to disclose that information that, quote, was inconsistent with or undercut the assertions contained in the FISA applications and, of course, thus resulted in inaccurate information being included in the applications. Okay, what's that FISA judge thinking tonight? Now, this includes, by the way, information that Carter Page had been working with a U.S. intel agency, likely the CIA, for years. That's what he gets rewarded with, an investigation after he's been helping the CIA for years. So what happened? Well, instead, that exonerating fact was edited out of an email by FBI lawyer Kevin Kleinsmith, who also, along with Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, was taken off the Russia probe once their anti-Trump biases were made public. Now, I know you're probably asking what I've been asking myself all day. How could an impartial investigator, you're the Inspector General, and it's your lifetime goal to be an Inspector General, looking at all the facts, all the text messages, the exculpatory and the damning information, both that were left out in key places, the sheer volume of informants and agents involved in Crossfire Hurricane, how can you determine there was no political bias in the FBI's handling of the Russia probe? It defies not just common sense, but the evidence as Horowitz himself developed. Nevertheless, Horowitz gave Democrats the talking point they craved.
There was no treason, there was no conspiracy, there was no tapping of Trump's wires.
The investigation was not a coup or a coup attempt.
This report confirms that the predicate for the FBI's investigation was valid.
There was no political bias, no political motive. It doesn't surprise me at all. That's the FBI that I know and love.
These people are sick. The FBI you love was trolling for damaging information, trolling for sources, trolling for anything to fuel the phony Russia theories that were cooked up long before the summer of 2016. Democrats should not breathe a sigh of relief tonight. U.S. Attorney John Durham publicly came out to contest its findings, saying, based on the evidence collected to date, last month, we advised the Inspector General that we do not agree with some of the report's conclusions as to the predication and how the FBI case was opened. Attorney General Bill Barr also disagreed with the IG's conclusions, writing, the Inspector General's report now makes clear the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign based on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken. FBI officials misled the FISA court, omitted critical exculpatory facts from their findings, and suppressed or ignored information negating the reliability of their principal source. The bottom line is that the forthcoming Durham report, which the Attorney General has been assisting him on, is far more comprehensive in scope. We're going to learn, I think, a lot more in the coming months. And despite the Democrat talking points and the facile coverage today, this IG report has provided us with a partial view of the corruption at the FBI and the politicization of the deep state. What do we need to do now? Well, we need to know the rest of the story sooner rather than later, so we can protect the election and the candidates of 2020. And that's the angle.
Laura Ingraham in the swamp. It's awfully filthy there tonight.
Hannity, okay, at about, I think it was footnote 473, I had to stop because I was getting so infuriated. And I'm so glad you had Carter Page on tonight. Your show was terrific, by the way, but I'm glad you had him on.
This poor guy.
He was destroyed. Like when Byron York is on, we were talking about Carter Page, whatever it was, a year ago, a year and a half ago, and he was sitting right here. We said, I mean, anyone who thinks Carter Page is like some, I mean, God bless him, is some like Russian asset running an operation, You don't have even the basic judgment to be like running a preschool, let alone a high-level agent at the FBI. It's complete outrage. His life was destroyed. He should get a lot of money for this.
I want Comey to come on this show for an hour. I'm giving him 3 hours of my radio show. You think he'll come?
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm sure he'll be right there. And then I'll have Brennan on my show the next night. Okay, that'll happen.
Well, then I get Clapper. You can have Brennan, I'll get Clapper.
And I'll see you a Strzok, and then you'll raise me a pig. All right.